Chris Fallows is a South African wildlife photographer, conservationist, and one of the world's leading authorities on great white shark behavior. His images of breaching great whites at Seal Island became some of the most widely published wildlife photographs on the planet. So who better to ask what really happened to the great white sharks of False Bay? Chris, welcome to BizNews.
Thanks, Linda. Lovely to be here.
Well, I think before we talk about the great whites, we've got to talk about those extraordinary breaching great white shots at Seal Island. For people who might not know the story, how did you realize you were witnessing something the world has never seen before?
It's a long story, but in a nutshell, as a young man, I'd already worked with great whites for 4 years at Dyer Island, which is close to Gansbaai, about 2 hours from east of Cape Town, for reference for those who don't know where it is. And I'd learnt, a fair amount about great whites in my time working with the White Shark Research Institute, and we'd done documentaries with Sir David Attenborough and various others, so had a good inclination of what white shark behavior all around the world was actually like. And when we started seeing Dyer Island starting to change, I, by that stage, as a guy in my young 20s, had saved up enough money to buy a rubber duck or rubber inflatable boat. And I decided to go look for great whites where I thought they may be, and that was in False Bay, a little tiny shelving of rock called Seal Island. And so in 1996, I headed out with a couple of very trusting friends, and we went out to Seal Island, and I'd recently finished working on a documentary with Sir David Attenborough's team where I'd watched a guy off the Farallon Islands in San Francisco throwing out a surfboard off the rocks and reeling it in, and a shark had come rushing up and grabbed it. And it gave me the idea to try something the size of a small seal. And I put out a little life jacket that was exactly the same size as, what a young of the year seal was. And we started towing it at Seal Island, not really expecting much because my mates hadn't allowed me to take fish with in the rubber boat for very good reasons. So I thought, well, let me try with a little life jacket. And we started pulling this life jacket behind the boat, and suddenly, literally not even much more than a minute after we put it in, a small great white, came flying out the water with it clamped across its jaws. And it was unbelievable. We'd never seen a flying great white before. And I thought, well, was this an incredible one-off? And the shark spat the life jacket out. We went and reattached it. My mates were screaming to go home, but as I was in charge of the boat and the tiller, I said, no, we're going to try this again. And we then towed it for probably about half an hour. And it was at the point where I was thinking, well, what an incredible thing to see, but it was a once-off. And then a proper great white. The only time in my life I've actually been able to say the shark was bigger than the boat, came flying out the water. And the penny really dropped then that not only had we discovered that there were great whites at Seal Island, which up until that point, people had gone fishing for them there and other people who tried to do research there had never found them there. So we learned that they were doing extraordinary things. And that started, in the mid-90s, a career for me that spanned, nearly 3 decades working with those animals. And once I got to know them a little bit better and I improved my equipment that I was using, I then started taking photographs that, they garnered headlines all around the world. But quite simply, I was the person that was very lucky to find those animals. And I think if anybody else had had similar opportunities, their photographs would have done as well. But it was a lucky stroke of fortune on my part and an incredible thing to be part of.
False Bay used to be this global hotspot for great whites, but now they seem to be gone. Have they disappeared completely, or are we looking at a massive drop in numbers?
Yeah, so the Seal Island False Bay became world famous through all the different documentaries as the spot on the planet to see great white sharks hunting. And Gansbaai became known as the great white shark capital of the world. And together with Mossel Bay, those 3 areas had what was widely accepted as having the largest population of great whites on the planet. What we've seen in not even recent times anymore, from about 2007, and we kept data on every single one of the nearly 3,500 trips we did at Seal Island, we started seeing numbers of the sharks starting to decline, and slowly at first, and then ever faster. And by 2014, that decline became pretty much precipitous. And in 2018, we saw the last ever great white at Seal Island. So when you ask me, are there no great whites left? There hasn't been a white shark seen at Seal Island for all intents and purposes since 2018. Gansbaai suffered the same fate, and whilst they might see 1 or 2 sharks, inshore every year, they used to be seeing on many days upwards of 20 white sharks. So for, like I say, all intents and purposes, the white sharks have completely disappeared from those areas, and we are still seeing small numbers further up the coast. But when you consider between Gansbaai and False Bay and Mossel Bay, there were well over 1,000 white sharks. The fact that people are seeing, a literal drop in the ocean further up the coast is in no way signifies that these animals have moved eastwards. It's just a very small part of what was once a very large population.
Well, to Orcas, they were called Port and Starboard, are being blamed for attacking great whites and removing their livers. Is this one of the reasons they vanished?
Port and Starboard have certainly played a part in having an impact on the few white sharks that were left. But I think it's incredibly important to state that the crash of the white shark population precipitated Port and Starboard's appearance by at least 7 or 8 years. So in the case of False Bay, before Port and Starboard were ever even seen at Seal Island, that entire population of sharks had completely disappeared. So in my opinion, you certainly cannot blame something or somebody that was never even at the crime scene. And the same holds true for the rest of South Africa. Yes, Port and Starboard have been seen killing white sharks, but firstly, they've killed very few. In the last 9 years, they've been implicated in a maximum of 10 different instances where white sharks have been killed. But subsequent to what has been a precipitous crash in the white sharks population. So in my opinion, having been there kind of from beginning to end, Port and Starboard are being used as the scapegoats to essentially, blame them on the crash of the white shark population, whilst we continue to ignore the devastating human impacts like the Natal sharks board, as well as a relatively new fishery that's been around for about just under 2 decades now, called the demersal shark longline fishery. And together, those two very, very much human induced impacts caused in the region of around about 70 to 100 white shark deaths a year. So if you look at 70 to 100 white shark deaths that are purely attributable to human means, as opposed to one that is blamed on those 2 orcas a year, I think even for the most challenged mathematician, it's quite easy to see, where the real effects are.
Well, can you explain what impact they had?
Or the orcas or the fisheries and nets?
No, the fisheries and the nets.
Okay, so the Natal Sharks Board kills on average around about 25 great white sharks a year. And that number has been dropping as the population's been dropping. So if you looked at in the mid-1980s, even 1990s, they used to average around about 40 great whites a year. The white shark population was never nearly as robust as what people thought. Being an apex predator, right at the very top of the food chain, there are never huge amounts of predators when you compare them to prey. So with a population of somewhere around about 1,000 to 1,200, 1,400 animals, that population was already under pressure by the Natal Sharks Board, and you could see it through their net captures declining over the years. When we brought in this fishery called the demersal shark longline fishery that targets smaller species of sharks that we export to Australia for fish and chips, we found out that fishery was not only killing these small sharks that were primary prey source for the white sharks, but were also entangling and killing many white sharks as a result, because the white sharks were where these small sharks were, because both the fishery and the white sharks were targeting the same source. And we learned that this fishery was killing somewhere around about, it's no exact figures, but somewhere around about 40 to 60 white sharks a year. So cumulatively, with the Natal Sharks Board, the effect was so much more than the white shark population could ever sustain.
Who gives licenses to these longline fisheries that you were been talking about?
So the fishery is given licenses by the Department of Forests, Fisheries and the Environment, and they manage the fishery on a base or on a through a practice called total allowable effort. So they give a certain amount of permits every year, and those boats are allowed to catch as much of the shark species that they are legally allowed to target as they like. And as if the devastating effect on the white shark's not bad enough, the two primary target species of this fishery, which again are exported to Australia for fish and chips, are a species called the soup fin shark, locally known in South Africa as walleye, and another species of shark called the smoothhound shark, which in Australia is called a gummy shark. And when this fishery started fishing for those two species in the early 2000s, the one species, the smoothhound, wasn't even listed as threatened, and the soup fin shark was then at that time listed as a threatened species. Nowadays, those species have gone, their populations have crashed so much that the smoothhound is listed as endangered and the soup fin shark is now listed as critically endangered. So both are imminently threatened with extinction, yet the department still sees fit to allow the targeting of them on an industrial scale to export to Australia for fish and chips that brings in almost no revenue to South Africa. It has nothing to do with food security, and it has caused the complete collapse of arguably the equivalent of Africa's lion in the form of the white shark, which has a huge amount of devastating and cascading ecological effects, and has also caused the collapse of an ecotourism industry that was valued at over a billion South African rand a year. So in all respects, it's very difficult to see how this can continue to happen along our coastline.
So, do you think there's awareness in Australia that their appetite for flake, was sold as fish and chips, that this is causing this problem in South Africa?
Well, I think up until a few years ago, ignorance may have been a legitimate excuse, but certainly not in recent times. In Australia, there are various environmental groups that are now campaigning have been campaigning very hard to change the mislabeling of seafood and make Australians aware of what they're eating. They're eating incredibly long-lived, slow-growing, late-to-mature species that produce relatively few young that are now listed as endangered and critically endangered. So, yes, a couple of years back, I could say ignorance played its part, but nowadays, I can't believe that after various shows on BBC, CNN, 60 Minutes, and many others, that Australians are not aware of what they're eating.
So, are you putting pressure on the department to tighten the fishing regulations?
We've been putting huge energy and effort into putting pressure onto the department, so much so that in 2019, the former Minister Barbara Creasy was forced in the first time in South Africa's history to set up an expert panel to look at what was happening to the sharks off our coastline. However, that expert panel was comprised of the very same people that put the regulations in place for the demersal shark fishery to fish in the first place. So it was essentially a tick box exercise to placate the masses that were starting to say, we don't want this fishery destroying our coastline and our future and any ecotourism benefits or sustainable fishing opportunities that the next generation may have. Sadly, there's a tremendous amount of politics afoot in shark science in South Africa that non-governmental shark scientists are simply not listened to. And it is a small handful of government-affiliated shark scientists who make all the decisions. And the reality is, if you look at the scoreboard, it's very plain to see what has happened over the last few years and what has transpired under the current management styles approach. So, I'm not a scientist. I have, however, contributed to many scientific papers and spent a huge amount of time on the ocean. And for me, it's been a very sad indictment of the negative aspects related to science and how this, faculty that we hold on in such high esteem can also be used for the purposes of elevating academic aspirations and people's own desires, rather than looking after the animal that essentially built those people's careers and has done so much to elevate South Africa in the eyes of marine conservation around the world.
Well, some people say that the sharks have moved to the Eastern Cape and they are seen at Plettenberg Bay. What do you say about that?
Well, Plettenberg Bay, certainly the numbers are actually decreasing. I think what's happened in recent years is that, and I suppose I and a few others have a part to play in this, is through all the photographs and documentaries we did, people became ever increasingly more aware of these animals. People wanted to see them. People started flying drones, taking helicopter tours. And suddenly, the same shark might be seen by 3 or 4 or 5 different people, and suddenly it's 5 different sharks. The reality was that people that have been recording the animals at Plettenberg Bay for over a decade, their numbers, their statistics show a decrease in those numbers as well. Plettenberg Bay has not got a lot of different white sharks. If there are 20, 30 animals there, it's a lot. And in recent times, that number's down. The one and only remaining location in South Africa where there seems to be a reasonable sized population is near East London at a place called Sinsa, where people are seeing, 30, 40 different white sharks there. But I think it must be put into perspective the fact that there used to be 1,200 white sharks along our coastline. So if you've got 30 or 40 left, I'm no mathematician, but that's probably like 2 or 3% of that population that still remains. And that is no ways viable. And if you look at what is typically known as the Basin Effect, which is how a population's contraction is measured. If you look at a population being a basin, when you drain the water out of the bottom of a basin, at first that water drains on the sides, and so we've seen that in the Western and Southern Cape, as well as the Natal Sharks Board is seeing lower numbers, and eventually the population only is in the middle of the basin and near the plug. And that's what we essentially are seeing in the Eastern Cape. And the area where these white sharks are in the Eastern Cape around Sinsa correlates perfectly with where the last few remaining small sharks are, where the demersal shark longline fishery is not allowed to fish. But that fishery, despite all that has been exposed through whistleblowers that we brought up, through using our own vessels to catch them in marine protected areas, laying charges ourselves, that fishery is still allowed to fish. So the moment those white sharks move out of that area, they will be caught eventually by that fishery. And the Natal Sharks Board is still fishing for white sharks using drum lines and using shark nets as it has always done. So I would put my head on a block, and I really hope I'm wrong, but those few white sharks will in time disappear. And all those people that have been saying they've simply moved east, those white sharks, as long as we have the Sharks Board and the demersal shark longline fishery, those animals in time will also disappear.
Just quickly explain the fisheries. So are they local, the fisheries? And how do these longline work?
Okay. Firstly, yes, they are South African. They are given permits by the South African government, and they are 100% legal. So people that are blaming the Chinese and foreign fishing fleets for the disappearance of the great whites, that's not true. It's our own fleet that is doing it in South Africa that is government sanctioned. The way a demersal shark longline fishery works is quite simple. Demersal simply means bottom. So they set their lines on the bottom of the ocean to target small shark species. It is comprised of a very long line called the main line, and then you have secondary lines, if you can imagine branches coming off the trunk of a tree, and those terminate in a hook. And then those small lines are spaced at sometimes several meters apart from each other over many kilometers. So you have hundreds, sometimes thousands, and in certain types of long line, not this particular fishery itself, you can have millions of hooks on a single line. But in the case of the demersal shark longline fishery, they'll come into an area, they'll set their lines. Initially, they'll have a high catch per unit effort. So on many hooks, they'll have sharks. And they'll fish the same area until they have a very low catch per unit effort, and then move to the next area, essentially like farmers plowing grids and removing all the produce from those grids. So the shark longline fishery does essentially the same thing in the ocean. And it's an incredibly effective fishery. And with the two target species, the soupfin and the smooth-hound shark, both of those species aggregate in large numbers. So when the shark longliners find them, they pretty much take them all, mature animals, young animals, the whole lot. And in the case of the siphon sharks, some of those animals are 50, 60, 70 years old. They only become sexually mature into their 20s. So it's a fishery that is completely unsustainable on every level.
So what do you want South Africans to know? Do you want them to know that this absolute resource that we have, something beautiful that you've been filming, is disappearing because of an international Aussie appetite and the government's failure to look after them?
Yeah, I think it's a case of apathy, and then in certain cases, people being complicit in allowing this incredible resource to disappear. I don't want to sound like a prophet of doom, but there's no ways in hell the white shark's coming back to anywhere close to its former glory or playing the ecological role it once did, whilst we have the Starboard and the demersal shark longline fishery in place. The demersal shark longline fishery should be removed tomorrow. It's as simple as that. It should have happened 20 years ago. With the Natal shark sport, yes, I can understand people are scared of sharks when they go into the ocean, and in Natal they have a bather protection program. But you can use non-lethal means to have the same effect as putting in drum lines and nets that kill not only potentially dangerous sharks, but things like turtles, whales, rays, and all sorts of other animals. So we can move very progressively towards living sustainably with our ocean by implementing those things. And, just to remind people, the great white sharks at their prime were attracting more than 100,000 people to South Africa's shores every year, that stated that their primary reason for coming to South Africa was to see the great white shark. We had more than 200 documentaries, the likes of Planet Earth, Blue Planet, Life, the whole Air Jaws series, that were all filmed in South Africa around the great white shark, that gave South Africa unprecedented global and free exposure of our natural resources, created thousands of jobs, and was sustainable in perpetuity. So this is what we've lost through very bad management, a huge amount of politics in our science. And I really believe it's time to move on from using things like archaic shark nets, which might have been, justifiable 50, 60, 70 years ago. But today, with modern technology and a different way of thinking, I believe we can certainly move in a more progressive route.
Chris, are there lessons in how we protected the humpback whale for great white sharks?
Yeah, Linda, I really think there are. As I and my wife were very lucky to be involved with the great whites from the very first day of the discovery of those famous flying sharks till the tragic day when I took the last ever photos of them. So incredibly, when I first started working with white sharks in the early 1990s, we never saw humpback whales. And if you saw one or two in a year, it was a big deal. We actually used to leave the great whites to take our guests to show them that whale. And that was in the post-industrial whaling era, where their numbers had been so depleted, there simply weren't many left in our ocean. But through enlightened and accepting governance, and individuals making the global community aware that these were highly sentient, very intelligent animals, they had strong family bonds and a deep sense of social caring, we realized that in many respects, they're no different to us. And as such, we protected them in pretty much all waters around the world. And yes, there are sadly a couple of nations who still do see fit to kill them. But in the late 1990s, we started seeing, those ones and twos a year turn into threes and fours. And by the early 2000s, suddenly we were seeing a trickle. By the 2010s, those numbers became 10s and 20s. And unbelievably, nowadays we are seeing super groups of these humpback whales that can number over 100 in an area the size of a rugby field or football field. And just on the 30th of December last year, my wife and I were once again very privileged to be there. And on the day where we took a world record of 300 different fluke photos, so 300 different individuals that we photographed in one day in one small area. And I think, it's pretty unique that you can tell these two stories relating to two of our ocean's most iconic species from almost beginning to end, certainly in the case of the white sharks, but pretty much with the humpbacks and whales. So we saw incredible numbers of white sharks and eventually lost them. And we saw very few humpbacks, and now we have very large numbers. So, we tell these two very different stories of the two very different paths that we can go on as humanity. We can either become acceptant of the animals' roles that they play in the ecosystem, the incredible values they have, and the right that they have to live on this planet, as we have with the humpback whales, or we can go down this route of ignorance, political infighting, and bad governance, as we have with the white sharks, and see this incredibly ecologically important apex predator disappear from our oceans, and in time understand the negative ramifications that will have. So yeah, we tell a story from two very different or through two very different routes.
Well, Chris Fallows, thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for the opportunity.